Releasing Trauma is sponsored by the Global Association for Trauma Recovery. The Global Association for Trauma Recovery is a social impact organization serving as a resource for survivors and their families, dedicated to facilitating change by spreading trauma-related awareness and thus creating a more trauma-informed world. Learn more at gaftr.org. Welcome to Releasing Trauma, a Survivor's Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. I am a survivor of emotional bullying, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and grief. After losing my husband in 2019, I set off on a new adventure to help other women release their trauma and create a life they can cherish. Each week, I will feature a guest expert or a survivor to share their stories, tips, wisdom, and more. The goal is so that you can take away even just the smallest nugget of information you can use in your life right now to make a change, and to remind you that you're not alone. There is life after trauma, and you can move from victim to thriver and create a life you can cherish. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. With me today is Dan Shapiro, and we're going to talk about moving on from trauma. So Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, I always like to have our guests start out with telling us a little bit about themselves. So why don't you share a little bit about your story?
Sure. So I live in Chicago. I'm a trial lawyer. I've been doing that for a long time. I graduated from the University of Chicago Law School in 1982. And prior to that, I went to the University of Illinois, where I met the young woman who became my wife, which is really the centerpiece of the story, our relationship and her. When we met in college, we got married while I was in law school. She and I both worked. She had an MBA and was in the business world and was really good at it. And when we were 30, we were the same age. We started having kids. We ultimately had 3 children. And when we turned 40, Susan, my wife, had a neurological event, a hemorrhage in her brain that's caused by something called a cavernous angioma, which I won't get into in any detail. It's not actually central to the story, but it's a collection of blood vessels in your body that are in a place and exist, and they shouldn't. In this instance, because the vessels were in her brain, and in the brain, real estate is everything. Neurologists and neurosurgeons will tell you and told me. Her cavernous angioma was not operable because of where it was in her head. And she wound up having 2 hemorrhages. The first when she was 40, which was somewhat debilitating but manageable. The second 2 years later, which was catastrophic, caused sorts of impairments to her vision, her speech, profound changes in her ability to move around, just control over her body. And it all degraded over time. Our kids, when this happened, were little. They were 10, 8, and 4. And so I became the caregiver for my wife at that point, and in a lot of ways, a sole parent to our 3 kids. And I was also practicing law as a partner in a law firm in Chicago. That started a journey that lasted for the next 20 years. And Susan died a little over a year ago this past June. And the book that I've written, called The Thin Ledge, is a really, what I hope is a really brutally honest assessment and record of that experience, being a giver, experiencing the illness of a loved one, falling short a lot of the time. I've been told a number of times that that the book does not depict me as the hero, and I'm not, and I wasn't. I certainly did the best that I could, but the best that I could was not always good enough. And I found that in writing something that was really honest, it would also be really useful, because that's the nature of these sorts of traumatic experiences. We're all human and imperfect, and that was the record I tried to capture.
Well, for one, I'm very sorry for the loss of your wife. I don't even know where to begin with this. So, you find yourself all of a sudden as a, full-time caregiver, basically a single parent, that had to create a huge traumatic experience for not only you, but for the kids to watch their mom, deteriorate.
Yeah, it was a traumatic experience for everybody. I mean, it was my kids, Susan's parents, who were watching a relatively young woman in her 40s really struggle and really be afflicted by something that was unfair and severe. And I mean, it touched a lot of people because it was so dramatic and difficult, and everybody just sort of watched this little family be so deeply challenged by this experience, which absolutely, I think traumatic is maybe one of the more benign ways to describe the experience.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure. So how did you deal with did you deal with the trauma as you went along, or were you so busy in survival mode that you didn't really have a chance to really, recognize and experience the actual full trauma until after she was gone?
Well, it's a difficult answer because I'm not actually sure that I know what the real truth of it is. I think some combination of that. I think to some extent the number of things that I had going on and the number of plates that were spinning was really a salvation for me, because I was very busy making a living, taking care of somebody who was, impacted and injured the way Susan is a lot of things, including expensive. And so dealing with that, was something that took a lot of my time, both in terms of being a caregiver, in terms of making a living, in terms of being a dad to 3 young kids. All of those things were really helpful to me in the sense that they kept me busy. I would say the relationship with my children was helpful to me because it was a wonderful thing. I mean, there's very little good that came out of this, but I would say that the relationship that I had with my kids during that period of time and continue to have with them as they're adults and having kids of their own now is just so special to me that I'm very thankful for it. So there was that. And then, the other part of it is that I was really fortunate in that I had the resources to go see a therapist, which not everybody is able to do. And that was helpful. I ultimately, while I had to work and make a living and do my job, I didn't spend a ton of time, but not a ton of time, worrying about expenses in the way that I think probably most people would. And I've said many times during the experience and since that I don't know how people without some reason. I mean, I'm not a wealthy person, but I sort of, maybe middle class, upper middle class. But what does everybody do who don't have those resources? How do they cope with this? I think it's just, you take a brutal situation and you make it that much worse. And so to some extent, I was really very fortunate.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there are so many out there who don't have those resources, don't have access to the resources. I discovered this when I first became a trauma recovery coach, that the people who really truly needed my help couldn't afford it.
Right.
And then that's why I started the Global Association for Trauma Recovery a few months ago, was because I feel that every survivor has the right to thrive, and everybody has the right to the resources and support that they need to heal from their traumas.
And so, I think it's just in a set of unfair. I mean, the unfairness starts with the affliction that this young woman, mom, wife, gets tagged with for absolutely there is no reason to it. There is no fairness to it. And it just is what it is. And then the unfairness, I think, for people in different circumstances and different places, I think the unfairness just sort of compounds over and over again. And in a way, I had these 3 kids that were, such a good part of my life. I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I'll use the word blessing because I can't think of a better one. That was a blessing for me, in its own way unfair. I mean, I to be entitled to that. So there's a randomness to all of this that is very real too. And that's a part of what I write about in the book. And it's a part of the truth of this. It is random. It's sort of, it's arbitrary.
Right. What are oh my gosh, I just totally lost my question. I'll move on to something else and then it'll pop back in my head. So, what are some of the lessons that you've learned over the years as far as, being a caregiver, being basically a single father, and being a trauma survivor?
Well, I would say that the big lesson for me was to be humbled by the whole experience. I was always pretty good at, I wasn't the most talented kid in the class, but I worked pretty hard. And so I could sort of push through, and just by dint of hard work and effort, I could sort of get to where I wanted to be. I think as a caregiver over a long period of time, that's not true. The idea of finding my limitations, where I would sort of burn out and become ineffective and become unhappy and dysfunctional as a human being, those were all very new things to me. I had not experienced any of that before. And I think learning that this is bigger, the circumstance is bigger than my ability to cope with it, was something that was new. I was overwhelmed at certain points. And I think understanding that and accepting it and then dealing with it was a real lesson for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a caregiver for my stepmom for 4 years. And so, I can understand to an extent of, the overwhelm and all of that, as you try to take care of kids, work a job, and, all of that. One of the things that I know from, my time as being a caregiver and also just being a parent is that, one of the things that I always put onto the back burner was myself and my own self-care. Did you find that same thing kind of happened to you, that, your needs and your your own self-care just kind of went onto the back burner because you were so busy taking care of everybody else?
I think certainly that was a part of the experience. It wasn't all the time. I can't say that 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 I suffered that way for 15 years, because I don't think that's true. I think there were times like that. There were times when that wasn't true. I had in addition to my children, I have siblings, and my mom at the time were all very supportive, and so a lot of those kinds of needs, I have friends, were met, but not always. And sometimes, I was sort of left short of what I needed, for sure. And that's part of the experience too. I don't really know how you could get through. I was. It was a 15-year period when Susan and I were, from the time she came home from the Rehabilitation Institute until we separated, was 15 years. That's a long time. And you cycle through different things during that period of time. Some of them, those periods were more sort of barren for me. Some of them weren't. And so I think I had some of all of that.
Yeah. Um, in the summary that you sent me, you said that you found guidance in Jewish religious philosophy, and that kind of helped you to figure out, what is right, what's okay, etc.
Yes.
So how did you kind of come across that, and how did that, play a role in helping you to overcome the traumas?
Right. So as I mentioned, I'm not a religious person. I am of the Jewish faith, but it's never played a very big role in my life. What happened was, and it's a touch convoluted, but I think I can make it understandable and simplify it. When you're doing all of this, when you're a caregiver and you're trying to figure out what's best for the person you're caring for and your kids and yourself, the issue for me was, how do you figure out what your obligation really is and where it stops, and where you just have to suck it up and continue on, and what is your moral code? I mean, how do you decide what's right and wrong in that regard? At what point do you think about yourself first? At what point should you not do that? And I found that navigating that was very challenging. I didn't particularly find friends and relatives on that subject reliable, because they were so empathetic and kind that they were always going to give me the benefit of the doubt. And so in that odd way, I sort of didn't trust those conversations. I really wanted to know what the morality was of the decisions that I was making and how to think about my situation. And I found that religion was the place to look, because it wasn't going to mold itself because of empathy or sympathy. It wasn't going to mold itself to what I wanted to hear. It just is an institutional thing. It is the religion captures the morality of the religion. And then you come to it and you say, well, what does it say about what my obligations are here? What does it say about how I should live my life? What does it say about what I need to give up, what I can have? And I found that institutional, thousands of year old thinking on those subjects was really sturdy. And I could look at that and say, okay, well, this I can rely on. This I can trust, because it doesn't depend on me or somebody's sense of friendship or love for me. It just is. And so that was very helpful to me. It was this fixed sense of morality that I could look to.
That makes absolute sense. That makes perfect sense, actually. Because like you're right, there's a moral code here that you can look at and interpret for yourself, and it kind of almost makes those decisions for you in a way. Well, Dan, this has been, fantastic talking with you. I really appreciate it. How can people find you and find your book? You're on mute.
Okay.
There you are.
I don't know. The last thing I heard you say was that makes perfect sense.
Oh, I was saying, that makes perfect sense because, it's a written moral code that you can use to just basically, give you the answers that you seek as far as the dilemmas that you're facing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're talking to a friend, or you're talking to your sister, or you're talking to a parent or anybody else who has a relationship with you, are they going to really tell you? First of all, do they know? Which is the threshold question, because they haven't lived this reality. And so do they really know what the answer is? And if the answer is harsh, are they going to tell you? Because, so how do you have that conversation with somebody and make it a reliable and useful conversation? I think it's very hard. But if you look to a religion, for example, I can't think of another. It's sort of, as a lawyer, I think it's sort of a set of laws, set of rules that are written down somewhere. And you sort of, because they're fixed like that, they're permanent, they're more reliable.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, it's almost black and white. It is what it is. What it says is what you do.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me today and sharing your story. Letting us know that, for those who are going through something similar, they're not alone.
Right. And I do think the feedback I'm getting on the book is that people I get a lot of inquiries and emails about somebody's personal circumstance and how that sort of meshes with what they read in the book that I wrote, and why it's helpful.
That's fantastic to know that you're helping somebody with your story. That's the whole point of sharing it.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Well, Dan, how can we find you, and how can we get a copy of your book?
Yeah, well, I think the best way to get a copy of the book, honestly, is through Amazon.
Okay.
The title of the book is The Thin Ledge, THINLEDGE, and you can easily find it there. There are reviews on it. I'm really pleased to tell you that the reviews are terrific and couldn't ask for more. And so if you go to Amazon, you can find the book. And my name is Daniel Shapiro, and you can find me on social media, Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm the Daniel Shapiro in Chicago, so you can find me there.
Sounds great. Thank you. And listeners, you know what I'm going to say. I will have all of Dan's information and the link to his book and everything in the show notes. If you're listening from one of our partner stations, just head over to releasingtraumapodcast.com, pull up Dan's show, and all his contact information will be there for you. Dan, thank you again for coming on and talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it on this end too.
And listeners, thank you as always for tuning in, and we'll talk to you in the next show.